So now, let us understand the facts. During this first round, I'd like to tackle 3 topics. What individual and collective mobility really costs, how socioeconomic and geographic status impacts access to mobility, and third, how the concept of freedom of mobility varies around the world. Yamina, I'll ask you to kick us off. I'd like to start by talking about cars. Car dependency has been a dominant factor in much of our mobility solutions for nearly a decade. What has been the impact of that?
Good afternoon. Thank you for your question. So as citizens, our need is mobility need. And the answer that has been provided by government since the first car, is a car dependency. So instead of answering to our challenge, our need, our mobility need by providing variety of solutions, the main solution that has been provided in developed countries has been and is still mainly car dependency. This has at least 3 impacts. One is the impact that you mentioned, which is the global warming, contribution to global warming. And contribution to global warming has an impact on health of the people. So it has an impact on, we are unhealthy, we live in unhealthy places because of the road transport. And then it has an economic impact because to allow for car dependency, our governments have been investing for several decades in infrastructures for these cars, so more roads. By investing in more roads, so we increase biodiversity losses and we increase the unfair share of space. There is much more space, the allocation of space, especially in cities, there is much more space allocated to car dependency to address the issues that are raised by car dependency than space, for example, for walking or for biking. So this is an unfair share of space. And then this has a direct impact, social impact, which is mobility poverty. Mobility poverty is the fact that people, and especially low-income families, cannot access to the basic services unless they use cars, and this has an impact on their affordability of their movement. So car dependency has failed in making what you call here mobility freedom. So it has done the opposite, completely the opposite of what we are talking here about.
So thank you, Yamina. Mons, would you like to talk about the space comment?
Yeah, I'd like to start with just giving a short comment on the issue of why transport and mobility is so challenging. There are 3 things. First of all, it is the fastest growing sector of emissions when we are in a place where we need to actually decrease emissions in order to reach the Paris targets. It is also the most fossil fuel dependent sector. And thirdly, it is the most locked in of our sectors. So infrastructure, cities, everything, as has been said, is locking us into a car dependency. And this makes the sector, although it today represents, as you said, 17%, but roughly 20 to 25% of CO2 emissions, 70% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Really the most difficult and challenging sector of all. Now we are in a place where we have electrification in some places of the world. For example, in my country, we have around 30% of vehicle sales are now fully battery electric vehicles. In the EU, it's around 12%. I think in China, it's around 22%. So it's happening now, and we're moving very quickly up the S-curve. So we are going to have a very rapid development in this arena. over the coming years. But it's opening up new challenges of affordability and accessibility of transport. So this is, but we'll come back to those challenges in a little bit.
Okay, thank you for that, Mons. Now, I'd like to ask Carlos a question. So, given the current dominance of cars as a primary form of transport, what kind of transformation is the mobility industry going through today to become more sustainable and affordable?
Well, thank you, Cecilia. It's indeed a very deep transformation. I would say it's a Darwinian transformation, as we can easily understand that within a few years, mobility companies will not be allowed to operate if they are not carbon neutral. So this transformation is really a Darwinian one. That's no doubt about it. What is also quite obvious is that the solutions that we are trying to bring as an industry, mostly about electrification, as Mons was mentioning, are not going to be solving all the problems. And I was listening to Yamina saying that in urban areas, you are devoting, or we are devoting, too much space to the car, which she qualified as being unfair. In that case, electrification will not solve that problem. So we have to make the breakdown between urban areas and rural areas in terms of solving the mobility problem for the citizens. What I would say is that recognizing the 17% that Mons was mentioning, it is indeed opening the door to a very complex problem to solve. It's not only about the mobility devices. I would say those ones are already on sale. We know that they are heavy. We know that they are using a lot of raw materials, and we have to save weight for the future. But as you mentioned in your introduction, we have to solve the energy problem. The energy problem is the foundation of any clean mobility for the future. Even if we think about rural mobility using cars, you will have to deliver a clean energy to support that. And that is the foundation of everything. Then on this foundation of clean energy, you can put clean mobility devices if they are affordable, so that the highest number of citizens can buy them. And with that, you will be able to solve a certain kind of problem. But you will not solve the problem of urban areas. Eventually, urban areas and rural areas may need different solutions, and perhaps countries from the north and countries from the south will not look at this problem in the same way, because the available wealth to solve this kind of issues is not the same. So indeed, a very Darwinian transformation for the mobility industry. Indeed, potentially different solutions for urban and rural areas, but there is a common foundation for all of this, which is clean energy. Without clean energy, most of these electrified solutions will not bring the expected benefits.
Thank you, Carlos. And Davis, both Carlos and Yamina commented about space uses, and then Carlos mentioned the difference between urban and rural areas. So when we think about the poorer communities and rural communities, what is important regarding access to mobility from your perspective?
Namaste, and I would like to start with the 17%. Somehow this is a very interesting number. I would be very happy if we can get, the pie chart of various continents, how it is contributing to that 17%, and the details with respect to urban and rural. While we are talking about freedom of mobility, I also would rather change this topic a little bit as freedom of responsible mobility. Mobility, yes, we are having today, but I think it should be more of a responsible mobility. And in the in the world of poor women, for an artisan, access to raw material market, access to finished good market, that is freedom of mobility. For a casual labor who is working in a field, access to the work area and coming back, that is a mobility challenge. For a mother and child, access to school, access to healthcare is still a very big challenge in the developing and underdeveloped countries. And since SEWA is a trade union, we have tendency to meet very often in person for all the union and organizing activities. But the challenge is, like as you said, since the availability of public transport itself is so low, the cost to that transportation is very high. In our side of the world, the cost goes up to 35%. And that is indeed very appalling and it is very discouraging. And therefore, I would rather say that for poor communities, when we are talking about this alternative energy sources, it is very important that we don't focus on things like cars because there is one driver and 3 empty seats. We rather should focus on electric bicycles or electric public transports, which can have a better bang for the buck.
Great. Thank you, Davish. I think it's important to understand that point you just made, that when we talk about mobility and we talk about transport, it does not equal cars. And today we should be thinking much more broadly. So thank you for that. Taming, the needs of young people are unique. Can you touch on that and explain a little bit how that varies from the mobility needs of adult men and women and families?
Thank you so much. I would like to start with saying that our realities and behavior towards transportation and mobility is very different, from what we used to know. As a young person, I think I can speak for a lot of young people. Personally, I love to take public transport. I love to feel safe in public transport because I can use my phone, I can work, I can do other things while someone is just at the steering of the wheel. And it's very important to understand that the times and methods have shifted. So rather than, bringing in solutions that just affect select few, it's very important to note that we can create solutions that can affect the masses and also bring in affordability when it comes to mobility. Because as a young person, I'm not really all about getting my own personal car. I really just want to move from point A to point B in a sustainable way and in a way that it doesn't break the bank, right? So our needs and behaviors are very different. In those days, our mothers, our fathers, they had cars. But right now, a lot of young people always tilt towards new technology. We are very quick to adopt new technology, and anything that works for us in a sustainable way that doesn't break our pockets works for us. So the behavior and trend patterns are so different, and our needs are also different because we want to travel for opportunities. I personally want to travel for opportunities, for employment, for social life. My family could be living in another state and I want to visit them. So the needs are very different and they are quite concrete. And it's very important that every solution that we have brings into context the realities and the needs of a lot of young people, because the times are different and our needs and behavior trends are also different.
Thank you, Tammy. And I think from that, we also have the reminder that when we talk about mobility, it's not really about the mode, but it's about the movement. It's about the need to get from one place to the other, and linking that back to what Davish commented around doing all of this responsibly. So thank you for that. Ben, understanding that some countries are highly motorized and others are still in the process of motorizing, what types of mobility needs exist for the countries that are still in that motorizing phase?
Sure. Thanks, Cecilia. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to participate in this great event. I want to also say I'm with World Resources Institute, which, although I'm located in Washington, D.C., we work globally in countries like Brazil, Mexico, India, China, Indonesia, and in the African region on many issues, but specifically on improving sustainable mobility. And I just wanted to note, sort of shift the conversation of whether this is about freedom of mobility or whether maybe a similar way of thinking about this in providing zero carbon, safe, and reliable access to opportunities, the jobs, the education, services, and the like that give people economic opportunity. I think just as how do you get from point A to point B? And one statistic that hasn't been mentioned, yes, we do have 16, 17% of global carbon emissions from transport. Much of that coming from wealthier countries, although growing in low and middle income countries. But the world sees about 1.3 million road fatalities per year. If we look at regions like Africa, for example, this is the number one killer of young people in these such regions. And you know, one of the reasons for this is because we aren't providing the adequate public transport systems, safe conditions for walking and cycling, urban land use and growth patterns that support sort of walkability and that compact access to services and the like. So when we get to this freedom mobility, I think we have to ask, how do we combine efforts to not only decarbonize, but to make our transport systems safer and more resilient to what people need to access these jobs and opportunities. So I would say invest in public transport, invest in better bicycling and walking, invest in better urban growth patterns. And I'll just end on the fact that IPCC just came out with this last report that says we're already at 1.1 degree warming. And they've actually specifically said the most cost-effective measures that we know of are in fact investing in public transport, safe walking and cycling conditions. I'll end at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So each one of you have brought up a number of issues. We've talked so far about decarbonization as a goal. We've talked about space. We've talked about cleaner electricity. We've talked about the idea of mobility being responsible. We've talked about mobility not equaling cars and moving back and forth. And we've talked about safety. Before we wrap up this phase, I want to turn it over to the debaters and see if anyone has any additional comments that they'd like to make respect to the facts. So Carlos, why don't you go first?
On this discussion with my teammates here, which is the fact that the different modes of transportation that we have been talking about, public transportation, cycling, whatever we have been talking about as opposing modes of transportation against cars. In fact, those modes of transportation are not new. They exist for a long time. Perhaps we could argue on the electric bicycles, but for all the other ones, they are competing with cars for at least 1 century. So the question that we are not raising here is why did the automobiles win that competition? Why did people select automobiles instead of selecting global transportation or public transportation or even bicycles? And that's a key question that we are not addressing here, but the citizen and the consumer at the end of the day has a say on that matter. And of course, it will quite quickly bring us also to affordability and to convenience and comfort and safety at the end of the day, also security. So those are some of the topics that we are not addressing here, but that should be taken into consideration when we say, well, there is too much of this and not enough of that. That's clear. But those two things have been competing for the last century. So what we are seeing today is the result of that competition. And if it happened that way, possibly it's because there were some key reasons that we need to understand if we want to unlock it the other way around.
Thank you for that, Carlos. Yamina, and then Davis, you'll have the last word on this one.
Yeah, I like very much the question from Carlos. Why did the automobile win this competition? For a very simple reason, because it's an unfair competition and you are very good lobbyists. So you managed to convince governments to stop the tram systems, the public transport system, and to invest in more roads. And then there is an alliance between the car industry and the infrastructure industry, because you make profit out of more cars, and more cars means more roads. and less of public transport. And given that everything has been privatized, everything became privatized, and our governments have been brainwashed, and even ourselves as citizens, we are brainwashed. And we are not free. You are not, the car, if you look at the advertising for cars, so it's always sold to us as more freedom, but actually it's not freedom, it's lock-in effect. You are locked in your car, you are locking the planet in more global warming, and you are locking yourself in more pollution at a high cost. And if you are low income, then you are locking even your income in the car dependency. So yes, the automobile industry has been very, very successful, but using unfair methods. And from moral perspective, if there is in the future, if the young generation, given global warming, would sue us, all of us, those who contribute directly or indirectly to the current situation, I guess you will be, the car industry and the infrastructure industry will be among the people who will be sued in the future. So, and we should not look at to the success of the car industry, we should look at to how to address human needs. And the car industry does not address human needs, it created car dependency with all the problems that are associated with the car dependency. It's really time for the car industry to acknowledge its failure in being an actor for development, an actor of the 20th century and a good actor for the 21st century. And if the car industry does not do that, so it will be left behind, which is the case today. The car industry is behind the challenges of the 21st century.
All right, thank you for that. And then Davish, I'm going to let you have the last word in this round.
Just to build on the existing conversation, I would rather also touch upon the point that the infrastructure for the public transport also needs to be developed. In India, lot of rural places, even if we think of public transport, the roads are not supporting the public transport. And therefore, we cannot separate the transportation and the infrastructure that supports the transportation. We need to look at it together. Otherwise, we will end up having vehicle, but no infrastructure to support it. And another topic which we have not touched upon is in near future, we are going to have more and more unmanned vehicles or drones and the regulations pertaining to that. Because when we are talking of mobility, we are not just talking of human being. We are also talking about the raw material and finished goods that can transport. Now, if I am thinking of a future where unmanned vehicle or a drone can do that, the lot of regulations pertaining to that needs to come up, which will optimize the overall travel.
Great. Thank you for that, Davish. That concludes our understanding of the facts phase. I think we're set up very well to move into our discussion, our next discussion.